Yo, I'm the type of guy who's scared to cross the street in case I get run over. But not even 100 years ago, boys my age were fighting one of the deadliest battles in history. And with news of an upcoming World War III every couple of months, it makes me curious what these guys really had to deal with. So welcome to World War I, where statistically, you'll find yourself spending the majority of your time in the trenches. Conditions depended on where you were stationed and what country you were fighting for, but in general, if you were fighting in a French or British trench, the conditions were way worse. While most French and British trenches were made out of sandbags, wooden planks, and mud, since the Allies viewed trenches as a temporary thing, the Germans, on the other hand, built theirs pretty shittily too, to be honest. But at least they used concrete, and some trenches even had electricity. But regardless of what side you were on, trench life was horrible. Whenever it rains today, it can be an annoyance. But back then, rain could be a death sentence. That's because a lot of trenches had no quick way of draining all that water. So effectively, you'd be standing in the same stagnant water for entire days. This is a problem because it led to a disease called trench foot. It's basically your foot slowly losing circulation, developing necrosis, and if it progressed far enough, could lead to it getting amputated. So many soldiers had a partner to check on each other to make sure that their feet were good. Are they good? I think so. What do you mean? It's been 30 minutes. Wait a minute. Let me lick them to be safe. Anyway, aside from trench foot, there were many other issues. Lice was a big problem, infesting the hair and clothes of the soldiers. And as the war dragged on, and soldiers stayed in these trenches, constantly cold and malnourished, illness started to become one of the biggest killers. It definitely wasn't helped by the fact that trenches were constantly overrun by dead bodies and rats, who ate both dead bodies and sleeping people. And this is all before we even talk about the actual fighting that happened during the war. So majority of the time, fighting happened through trench warfare. Pretty obvious since they're already all in trenches. Each side's trench was designed with a frontline trench, a secondary trench, and then a reserve. These two massive frontline trenches of each side ran parallel to each other, and this is where majority of the fighting happened. And this land in the middle was called no man's land. It was a stretch of muddy land with barbed wire and shell holes everywhere, and entering no man's land was a complete death sentence. Luckily, you usually had no reason to go into no man's land. Instead, you would stay in your side of the trench and use a periscope to see what was happening in no man's land. And unless you were Brittany Griner, the trenches should have been deep enough to keep you safe. It was never a guarantee though, and any time above the trench line would make you a victim to a sniper. And then there was the brutal way of actually gaining land during the war. Every now and then, you and your entire squadron would be forced to run into no man's land and overrun the enemy's trench, or die trying, all while being fired at by machine guns. Usually, if your team was able to make it to their trench, there would then be a bunch of close quarters combat, usually done with bayonets and shotguns, and lasting only a couple minutes before everyone was too exhausted to keep fighting. Once one side eventually ended up starting to win, they would end up starting to scout for the stragglers and finish off their exhausted enemies. And then there was chemical warfare. Wait, but isn't chemical warfare a war crime? Well, during this time, no. Actually, the whole reason chemical warfare is now a war crime is because of World War I. The Germans were the first to use gas, I know, big surprise, and opted for chlorine gas against the French. Although initially very successful, there was the occasional instance of this happening. Achoo! Oh my god, no! This happened because neither side really understood how to use gas effectively, but as the war progressed, both sides started to get a better understanding of how it worked, leading to less instances of them gassing themselves and more deadly gas attacks. During the war, the two main chemical weapons used were phosgene and mustard gas. Phosgene was definitely the more deadly of the two, accounting for 85% of World War I gas deaths, but mustard gas was way more terrifying. That's because, unlike phosgene gas, mustard gas causes a slow and painful death. Even if victims survived, they would have chemical burns, scarred lungs, and exponentially higher rates of cancer for the rest of their lives. But in truth, the majority of your time in the trenches, you weren't even fighting. Honestly, when I was researching this video, I was expecting the life of a soldier to be like that one COD map, Shipment, where it's a bunch of guys constantly fighting each other non-stop. But no, in reality, the majority of your time was spent doing chores like rifle inspections, digging out trenches, and trying to pump out water from the trenches. And some soldiers were waiting around so much that boredom started to become an issue. You know that saying, an idle brain is the devil's workshop, and the devil's workshop is usually doom scrolling? Yeah, it was becoming a real issue for soldiers because they just had nothing to do. So soldiers started to find ways to spend their time, which usually meant playing cards, gambling, and drawing sketches. Soldiers also often had to write letters back to their families because there wasn't any data available in the trenches, so no FaceTime for them. And talking about their everyday life, let's talk about food. Trench food was rough, as you could probably imagine. In the beginning of the war, the rations were rum, boiled beef, bacon, vegetables, and stale bread. But by the end of the war, people were basically eating whatever they could get, with one dish being pea soup and horse meat. The saving grace was the rum ration, which was much needed because most of the water brought back to the trenches was contaminated with gas. By the time the war ended, 10 million of the 65 million soldiers that fought died, with another 22 million sustaining injuries, which means there was a 50% chance of either ending up wounded or dying from the war. And then there was the mental effects. You've probably seen this meme before, and even though this is a soldier from World War II, it depicts the same thing many World War I soldiers faced, being shell-shocked. The war was so traumatic that even showing pieces of uniforms to ex-soldiers would cause them to have mental breakdowns. And that's not even accounting for the soldiers who came back without a scratch, but then started binge drinking from all the stresses of war and died as alcoholics. Also, a lot of World War I videos forget to talk about the soldiers from India and Africa. Yeah, honestly, I definitely would have forgotten about this too, but I was talking to my grandma, and apparently one of my great-grandpas fought in the World War. Apparently he was 6 foot, jacked, came back fine from the war, and won a bunch of medals, which is crazy because like in 3 generations, his bloodline went from fighting this crazy-ass war to drawing stick figures on the internet. So, you know, look, honestly, when I make my videos about the crazy stuff that happens in history, I usually don't feel any empathy because it's just numbers in an article about things that happened forever ago. Oh, 40 million Chinese people died in this ancient war from 2,000 years ago? Okay, whatever. You know, I don't care. But when you really look at pictures of these young men your age being sent out to wars that in the big picture they had nothing to do with, and then see those same guys give interviews as old men, you know, it's really sad to see. So, you know, while some aspects of your life might suck, there's a lot to be grateful for today. Anyway, like, subscribe, comment, bigger numbers, please, I want more. Another 1 out of 10 on my dashboard, please. Also, check out my Patreon. Okay, bye.